Thank you for the invitation to participate in the Boshell lecture series here at the Dallas Museum of Art, particularly as this resonates with your migration exhibition. My name is 𝗕𝗰𝗸𝗽𝗃, and I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Anthropology up at Appalachian State University in Western North Carolina. As an archaeologist, my research looks at the relationship between physical landscapes and cultural identities and political violence. I am currently involved in two different projects. One focuses on a pre-colonial landscape of slave raiding in Senegal, which is a country in West Africa. And the second project that I've been involved with since 2012 is the Undocumented Migration Project, or UMP. This project looks at a contemporary landscape of undocumented migration in southern Arizona and northern Mexico. And of course, that will be the topic of my talk today: backpack biographies, archaeological accounts of migrant suffering and survival in the US-Mexico borderlands. And I've tried to make the most out of this online format by providing links throughout this talk where you can go to learn some more information either about this project or migrant rights and social justice movements. I'd like to begin with a story by Victor, a Mexican migrant, 43 years old, who recounted part of his story to Jason De Leon, who directs the Undocumented Migration Project. And in this brief excerpt, Victor is describing or talking about a backpack that he's kept from his most recent journey. We walked for 5 days. We ran out of food and spent the last 2 days without anything to eat. I got very sick from walking so far. My blood pressure dropped very low while I was trying to climb out of a wash. We ran out of water, but were able to find a cattle tank. The water was very dirty, but we drank it anyway. We ended up throwing away our backpacks and our extra clothes on the 4th day. We put all our water into one backpack and took turns carrying it for a few hours at a time. In the end, I think we walked more than 60 miles. This was my 5th time trying to cross the desert, and I finally made it. I keep this backpack as a memento of that last trip. Now, of course, Victor's story is by no means unique. Each year, tens of thousands of undocumented migrants try to cross the US-Mexico border into southern Arizona. And in this context, they face, of course, psychological trauma, physical suffering, and all too often, death, as shown in this map. The organization Humane Borders has maintained a database going back over 20 years now, recording the deaths of nearly 3,500 undocumented migrants, represented here by red dots. As we'll see in a moment, this is likely a significant undercount of the number of people who actually died attempting to make this journey. When an autopsy is possible, at least a full autopsy, and that's not always possible, the immediate causes of these deaths can usually be traced to hyperthermia, that is extreme overheating, which should be no surprise as people are walking 60 miles through a rugged and extremely hot landscape with insufficient supplies. However, if we look at the ultimate cause of death, most of these can be traced to a series of border enforcement policies and practices that are predicated on the idea of prevention through deterrence, or PTD. Beginning in the mid-1990s, these policies essentially worked to funnel migrants away from urban ports of entry and urban areas into remote and rural regions where physical features, whether that's the Rio Grande River or the Sonoran Desert, would ostensibly work as a sort of barrier to migration. This funneling effect is, of course, made possible by growing investment in border personnel, such as the U.S. Border Patrol officers you see here, as well as border fencing, checkpoints, and surveillance infrastructure like the camera tower you see here and the military-grade drones that are constantly buzzing the skies of southern Arizona. The results of prevention through deterrence have been mixed. The success, on one hand, can be measured as a general shift in migration over the last 3 or 4 decades away from urban regions, such as the San Diego sector you see here on the left, and into more rural, remote sectors such as Tucson and Rio Grande. On the other hand, research by sociologists and scholars who have dedicated their time to studying migration issues, such as Daniel Martinez or Douglas Macy or Raquel Rubio Goldsmith, their work demonstrates that actually prevention through deterrence strategies play a minor role in the long-term kind of fluctuation of undocumented migration, particularly when that's compared to economic conditions, the sort of pull of people into the United States and the push of political violence in Latin America. In other words, these apprehension statistics, which you see here for the Tucson sector, show that hundreds of thousands of people continue to try to cross the US-Mexico border despite prevention through deterrence policies, and often by developing their own counter strategies to safely get across the desert and evade surveillance by US border enforcement. At the same time, these funneling effects have had a profound impact on rates of migrant mortality. If you look at the number of deaths for 2002 in the Tucson sector, it's at least 143, probably much higher, and that can be compared to over 333,000 apprehensions. If we compare the same region for 2016, we see there were also 143 deaths, but compared to just under 65,000 apprehensions. What this suggests is that the rate of mortality for migrants has gone up more than fivefold over the last 20 years or so. In other words, prevention through deterrence policies aren't stopping people from crossing the border, they're simply killing them in greater numbers. So, ironically, this also provides a sort of moral alibi because border enforcement can simply point to the natural conditions of the desert, the diagnosis of hyperthermia as a cause of death, and say that that's ultimately the cause of migrant death, rather than the underlying policies and practices that are putting people into remote and dangerous stretches of the desert in the first place. So the accounts of people like Victor and the statistics, thousands dead, hundreds of thousands apprehended, are key talking points in national discourse about undocumented migration. But what needs greater attention is the process by which these personal accounts sort of scale up into these gross statistics. In other words, how can we look at these big numbers and try to understand them in terms of the human experience of people surviving and suffering out there in the desert? Can we put a face to these numbers? Here I argued that archaeology can actually play a key role in sort of providing a bridge between these two ways of talking about and thinking about what's going on with undocumented migration. And so here we might turn to an archaeology of migrant backpacks as a sort of way to witness and memorialize this process. Backpacks can provide, as we'll see, a testament to hidden processes and document this humanitarian crisis of undocumented migration. They can also help us to memorialize the experiences and histories of migrants themselves. So this way of approaching the past, the contemporary past, is not unique to undocumented migration and the UMP, but draws upon a broader trend in archaeology over the last 20 or 30 years to study more recent phenomena from the last century or so. So we often think of archaeology as being a way to learn about experiences or histories that are hidden from us because they took place so long ago in the past. But an archaeology of the contemporary uses the same techniques, the study of artifacts, the study of sites and landscapes, to look at experiences and histories that are hidden from us in the much more recent past, whether that's several days ago or several decades ago. A great example of this is recent work on the archaeology of the Holocaust. There are a number of projects that are doing this, provided the website for the Holocaust Landscapes Project here. And these projects are largely looking at concentration camps in Eastern Poland, where upwards of 2 million people died during or under the Third Reich and Nazi rule. And these projects are important for providing a sort of material testament to the suffering and death that occurred in these spaces that amplify and resonate with, of course, the stories we have of survivors themselves. But archaeology can also go beyond illuminating personal experiences and help us understand this genocide of the Holocaust as a broader social process. So, for example, Israeli archaeologist 𝗕𝗰𝗸𝗃𝗵𝗶𝗄 at the site of Sobibor, a concentration camp in eastern Poland, has done excavations that show over the years the Nazis attempted to expand the gas chamber structures at the camp and basically create a more gruesome killing machine. And then as World War II was winding to a close, they attempted to cover up and demolish, hide the evidence for this genocide. That hidden history is, of course, now literally being brought to light through archaeological work. This is incredibly important because we live in an era in which 1 out of 3 Americans or Europeans can't really give you a detailed explanation for what the Holocaust was all about, despite the fact that this is a history that's commonly presented in history classes in school at all levels. The photo here also shows the importance of gathering people together to collectively remember this process, something that I want to return to as we talk about undocumented migration in the remainder of this talk. An archaeology of the undocumented was first developed by Jason de Leon through the Undocumented Migration Project beginning in 2009, 2010. I joined in 2012. Jason is currently a professor of anthropology at UCLA, and this project is really an interdisciplinary endeavor that involves archaeology, which I'll talk about, but also importantly, ethnography, photoethnography, forensic science, and insights from many other disciplines. If you'd like to learn more about this project, and I hope you will, I would strongly encourage you to go out and pick up a copy of The Land of Open Graves, Jason's book that talks about archaeology and how that intersects with these other ways of learning about migration to tell a more kind of complete story of the interplay between US border enforcement and migrant suffering down in southern Arizona. Before I get to the archaeology, let me give you a little bit more about some of the other disciplines that go into the UMP. First and foremost is ethnography. Over the last 10 years, Jason has undertaken hundreds of hours of interviews with migrants at shelters in towns in northern Mexico, such as Nogales and Altar. These are key kind of jumping off points or hubs for migration into southern Arizona. And his accounts and interviews with migrants have helped us understand how migrants prepare for this journey, as well as how they experience it en route and how this relates to their understanding of space and material culture. So I really want to emphasize, even though I'll be focusing on archaeology for the rest of this talk, an archaeological perspective would be nothing without the stories of migrants themselves. Our abilities to understand and think about migrant artifacts and sites is only made possible by putting these in conversation with the stories of people who have left these things out in the desert. Another aspect of the Undocumented Migration Project is a forensic science project that looks at taphonomy, that is how sites are made, or in this case, unmade, through the study of pigs that have been euthanized and dressed up in migrant clothing, like you see here in the lower left-hand corner, dark t-shirt, jeans, a plastic water bottle. And by studying what happens to these pig bodies over the course of several weeks, we have learned that it doesn't take very long, usually just 2 or 3 weeks, for the Sonoran Desert to render these bodies gone through extreme heat, bacteria, vultures, coyotes, and so forth. What this means is that the 3,300 plus bodies of migrants that have been found in southern Arizona are a significant undercount of the number of people who have actually died and whose bodies will never be recovered because they have been erased out there by desert conditions. Trying to work against this erasure, the Undocumented Migration Project has recently created a pop-up art exhibition spearheaded by Jason called Hostile Train 94. The exhibit was originally supposed to be hosted by 94 institutions around the globe. We have more than that now. This was also supposed to be something that took place in 2020. Some exhibits are currently open, others are still in the works. The pandemic has sort of created a staggered timeline for when these are going up. But essentially, this exhibition asks participants to complete and then help to hang toe tags for the more than 3,300 people who have died in the Tucson sector. And you see here a toe tag for a woman who died in 2012. Her body was actually recovered or identified by Undocumented Migration Project students and Jason while they were out on survey. So this one is a very personal death for many of us involved with the project. And if you would like to learn more about the life and death of Maricela, I would strongly encourage you to go and read Jason's book that I showed you earlier. If you'd like to learn where you could see or participate in one of these Hostile Train exhibits, I provided you a link to the website down there at the bottom. So I encourage you to check that out in the next several months. Hostile Train largely draws on an earlier art exhibition, State of Exception, that was hosted by Jason in partnership with Amanda Krugliak and Richard Barnes. and featured, among other things, a giant wall of hundreds of migrant backpacks. And the responses by viewers to this were mixed, as one might expect when talking about migration in the United States, but many viewers expressed a sense of sadness or sorrow at viewing this exhibit. And I think it's fairly clear to understand that this sense of sadness can be related to the fact that these backpacks evoke individual people. We can imagine them being worn across the shoulders of someone. And so we can imagine that person and also at the same time be contemplating their absence in the here and now. Of course, some of these backpacks are also powerful because they evoke very specific identities, like the sadly ironic Dora the Explorer backpack that you see here, presumably worn by one of the many children who make this deadly crossing across southern Arizona across the border into southern Arizona each year. I think the emotional power of this exhibit also works beyond simply our connections to individual backpacks, but also appreciating the sheer quantity of these. And these hundreds of backpacks are just a few of the thousands or tens of thousands that are scattered at migrant sites across southern Arizona. And they demand that we acknowledge the subjective experiences and absences represented by them, as migration can be kind of blown up from an individual experience into a social process and a humanitarian crisis. All this is to say that the backpacks provide a rather powerful window onto our understanding of processes of undocumented migration and its memorialization and commemoration in public consciousness. And I want to explore these two themes for the rest of this talk through two archaeological perspectives. The first, Object Biographies, seeks to sort of tell the story or narrate the life of archaeological artifacts by looking at how they were made, used, repaired, and ultimately thrown away. At the same time, Object Biographies invite us to consider how artifacts intersect with social lives, the experiences of people through these steps in their life cycle. For us, in studying undocumented migrant backpacks, we can use this approach to think about how the people wearing them went through the different stages of border crossing. I also want us to explore object afterlives, to borrow a phrase from Gabriela Soto, to think about what happens to these backpacks after they're discarded. Do they take on a second life? Do they simply decay out there in the desert? Or do they take on a second life in the hands of humanitarians or artists or us as archaeologists? So the backpacks featured in the State of Exception exhibit that I just showed you come from archaeological fieldwork undertaken across southern Arizona, undertaken with some of the undergraduate students you see here. And of course, the helicopter buzzing us is because having 10 to 12 people walk around the desert always invited the attention of US border enforcement. But through this work, we were able to essentially identify and document more than 300 migrant sites and collect artifacts from many of them, including more than 1,800 backpacks. The photo I just showed you is from the Altar. Let me go back a moment. The photo here is from the Altar Valley, which is on the western side of the study area we work in southern Arizona. You notice it's relatively flat. The key dangers are cacti like the cholla you see here in the foreground. And part of the study area is dominated by more mountainous, rugged terrain like you see here in the Coronado National Forest. So this is a map showing our study area. It's centered on the town of 𝗂𝗏𝗂 here in southern Arizona. On the west side of our study area is the Altar Valley that I just showed you that has long been a corridor for undocumented migration. There's another relatively level area here on the east side of our study area following I-19, the interstate between Tucson and Nogales. And this ruggedness index, the color you see in this map, measures elevation, steepness of terrain, as well as the overall surface temperature of the terrain, showing areas that are more difficult or physically uncomfortable to get across. And you see the dark orange here and the 𝗕𝗏𝗃𝗃 Mountains and the 𝗕𝗏𝗰𝗃𝗃𝗃 Mountains, those being places where over the last 10 or 20 years, people have been increasingly pushed into crossing the desert. And we see that reflected in the darker dots up in these areas compared to the white dots representing deaths from 20 years ago, concentrated over in the Altar Valley. All this suggests is that this funneling effect that has pushed people away from undocumented migration through the San Diego sector into more rural areas like the Tucson sector even works at a local scale, pushing people into the remotest of the remote stretches of the desert where they are more likely to encounter physical suffering and death. Our survey of this area involved documenting sites and recording artifact assemblages that we found at them. The artifacts were the sorts of things you probably imagine migrants would take with them, particularly water bottles, Red Bull cans, food wrappers, clothing, personal hygiene products, and so forth, as well as the backpacks that people use to carry this stuff. And where possible, we also recorded the objects that were found associated with any given backpack so we could understand sort of personalized toolkits that people were bringing with them. This pack obviously had a lot of medical and first aid items found within it. These assemblages allow us to draw some distinctions between the types of sites left by migrants out in the desert. Closer to the border, we find rest sites and campsites. These have a lot of water bottles and food canisters, but very few articles of clothing, very few backpacks. These seem to be places where people are stopping to rest, maybe lightening their load a little bit by getting rid of empty containers before they continue further north. We also find further north pickup sites where people have gotten rid of the vast majority of the things that they've brought with them: backpacks, dark clothes, personal hygiene products, the things that might potentially identify them as an undocumented migrant as they make their way further north out of the border area. These sites, particularly the pickup sites, show the end of the life of these backpacks for undocumented migrants. And this is what we find as archaeologists. So if we want to understand what these objects can tell us about the preparation and the experience of migrants themselves, we need to sort of move back in time and start at the beginning. How did these backpacks end up with migrants in the first place? And here our story starts at places like this, markets in Altar and Nogales, these key kind of hubs for migration in northern Mexico. And you can see that the backpacks are kind of a standardized kit. These are the sorts of things that we also see on migrant sites in southern Arizona. And even here, the standardization sort of already speaks to the horrible experience of undocumented migration or border crossing through the Sonoran Desert. Each of these backpacks has a volume of about 25 liters. So that's nowhere near the same size as like a big backpack one would need for camping out or doing backcountry camping. These are much more akin to a high schooler's book bag. So that 25 liters is nowhere near enough space to carry the water and food supplies one would need to comfortably survive 5 or 6 days out in the Sonoran Desert. At the same time, the standardization shows a shift from those blue, green, gray backpacks to much more recent camouflage backpacks. This is from a site we identified in 2013 that was probably deposited a couple of days or even a couple of weeks before we got there. And by this point, we had seen that many more backpacks had this camouflage design to them. This tends to mirror a standardization of the entire migrant toolkit that includes black water bottles, thought to be more difficult for Border Patrol to see in the hands of a migrant, but also black heats up your water to much higher temperatures. Water bottles, food supplies, migrant clothing, all of these things have come to form a kind of standardized migrant toolkit that represents also the consolidation of cartels, smugglers, and vendors into this sort of techno-industrial complex that really profits from vulnerable migrants in northern Mexico. So the standardization itself already sort of speaks to both migrant suffering as well as some of the strategies that people are using to evade border enforcement. At the same time, people being people tend to personalize objects, and we find many artifacts that have inscriptions or messages on them or are personalized in some way. Here you see a photo of someone writing a name or inspirational message on their pack before they set out for a border crossing. Once on the backs of migrants, these artifacts bear a more personal witness to people's experience of border crossing. Common use wear, that is kind of the wear and tear, on packs includes tears and fragments. You can see that about 1 in 5 backpacks that we found was simply a fragment of a backpack. And this damage is, of course, caused by the desert environment: sharp rocks, cacti, sharp tree branches and that sort of thing. So one can imagine if these are on the backs of migrants, that the people wearing them are also experiencing that same physical damage from the environment. At the same time, about 5% of the backpacks that we've recovered with UMP have some sort of repair to them. This certainly mirrors the resilience that migrants have to sort of overcome the pain and difficulty of traveling through the desert and to persevere. And the objects sort of tell us that same story. As I mentioned before, the vast majority of backpacks end up at pickup sites that are farther north from the border. In this case, you see the pickup sites being found in this kind of red circle area north of US Border Patrol checkpoints and virtual fence towers, where people are discarding the objects they brought with them to continue on by vehicle to Tucson and points beyond. At these pickup sites, we often find dozens, if not hundreds, or in some cases thousands of these backpacks, and each one attests to the experience of suffering, but also survival of an individual migrant. So just like the state of exception exhibit, the sort of consolidation and massing of these objects together can help us sort of scale up from individual experiences to better understand migration as a broader historical process. The backpacks are also found in association not just with each other, but within objects that tell a more personalized story. They often include clothing items, food packets, things that have been damaged, worn out, torn, and in some cases are even bloodied, paralleling, again, the injuries that migrants are experiencing in their journey. And in some cases, we find personal objects, whether personal documents or mementos or sentimental objects, or in some cases, even photographs, suggesting that people aren't necessarily leaving these things behind on purpose. They're needing to abandon them or they're losing them. These sentimental objects and their loss might be its own form of suffering that doesn't leave a physical wound. Speaking of objects being left behind, we can also think about other contexts beyond those pickup sites where migrant artifacts are discarded. At a number of Border Patrol turnoff sites we identified, these are sites near the side of the road where Border Patrol agents park their vehicles and hang out in their air-conditioned vehicles until they're called into action. We often find, not surprisingly, a lot of what we call recreational objects, tobacco canisters, beer cans, as well as artifacts associated with migrant apprehension, like the quick tie string handcuffs you see here in the foreground. But a number of these sites also featured migrant artifacts like backpacks and personalized items. Now, legally, Border Patrol agents are not supposed to force people to leave or abandon their belongings. So when we find these things at Border Patrol turnoff sites, it might suggest some of the petty ways in which agents, as the sort of hands of the state, deny migrants their rights in these contexts and reduce them really to kind of bare life and lacking any rights in the US-Mexico borderlands. And I'd like for a moment to share with you one account by a migrant woman, 𝗨𝗧, who's interviewed by the UMP members in northern Mexico, discussing her experience leaving objects behind.
Did you bring anything from home or something to remind you of
¿Llevaba
home?
algo con usted, un recuerdo, algo como sentimental de la casa, algo para acordarse de sus hijos, algo así?
Llevaba un pasadorcito chiquita de mi bebé.
¿Un pasador? Una de esas cosas que se chupa, ¿no?
No, pasador para el pelo.
Ah, como un peine, pero chiquito.
Del bebé.
Like a little baby's comb of my daughter's.
Do you have it with you right now?
¿Lo tienes todavía?
No me lo tiraron allá.
No, they threw it away.
Who threw it away?
¿Quién se lo tiró?
Allá fue donde los quitaron todas las cosas. Nos quitaron
they take
todas.
all of our stuff. ¿Quiénes?
Pues los de la migra.
When immigration took all of our stuff. They take everything.
And they left it in the desert, or they took
¿Y lo
it with
dejó en el
them?
desierto o allá en la oficina?
No, allá en desierto, ahí los
there in the
quitaron.
desert, they took everything.
Allá donde nos agarraron.
Where they got us. Tiraron todo allá. Yeah, they threw everything there.
Now, the story of 𝗨𝗧 is by no means unique. In fact, we've identified sites that we argue are apprehension sites. One of these comes from about 10 kilometers north of the US-Mexico border, where in 2013 we found a backpack with the name Miriam written on it in white marker, and this was surrounded by unopened food canisters. You see some peaches there, an electrolyte packet, some undergarments, as well as a list with names and phone numbers on it. And a find like this invites a sort of open-ended narrative. Who was Miriam? Did she successfully escape being apprehended by Border Patrol? And if so, did she survive without these objects that she had brought with her? On the other hand, one might think that she was apprehended here and forced to leave these belongings, including the phone numbers for people that she might need to be in contact with. So we'll never know what happened to Miriam or what exactly happened at this site, but I think sites like this help us to critically reflect on the suffering that migrants experience at the intersection of the desert and border enforcement policies and practices. This finally brings us to the question of object afterlives. How can we, or how should we, understand backpacks as symbols following their deposition by migrants in the Sonoran Desert? From some perspectives, like a xenophobic or anti-immigrant perspective, these can be understood in the ways described by this quote: Mexico is a dump, and they turn anywhere they go into a dump, starting in our deserts and in the communities they settle. This was a response to an article about the UMP in the Huffington Post back in 2012. And it draws a line straight through racist views of migrants as dirty and the deposition of these objects as trash out in the desert. So this begs the question of whether we can create alternative narratives, alternative representations or understandings of what these objects mean, much as we did for State of Exception exhibit. And in fact, we're not alone in that move. A number of artists have tried to take found objects from the desert to help tell or amplify migrant stories. A great example of this is the Migrant Quilt Project, begun over 10 years ago, and similar to the AIDS Quilt Project, attempts to create something comforting, like a quilt from an otherwise harrowing story. Here, the quilt has been stitched together from fabrics found out in the desert and left behind by migrants, and this tells the story or documents the names of 136 people who died in the Tucson sector in 2000 and 2001. Some objects are not taken up by artists or us as archaeologists, but are in fact simply picked up, cleaned up, and removed and thrown away in some other context. In fact, Arizona, the state government maintains the Arizona Border Trash website, which you can see here, that allows people to organize cleanups, sign up for cleanups, document where they're removing objects from the desert and how many of those objects they're taking with them. And if you plot the data which is available on that website, you can see that this is a not insignificant amount of migrant sites that have been cleaned up and migrant artifacts have been removed from the desert. This is from 2007 to 2014. And there are a lot of materials that have been removed from our study area there centered on the town of 𝗂𝗏𝗂. One can certainly be sympathetic with environmental moves to remove plastics that are decaying out there in the desert. But at the same time, I think it's important to consider these materials, their appropriation and their removal from an archaeological perspective on the long term, and the ways in which material culture is often vital to our efforts at collective remembrance. Let me take another example of what this might look like, the Trail of Tears. And this is a historical event in which 100,000 or more Native peoples were forcibly removed from the American Southeast to lands west of the Mississippi River in the 1820s. The history of the Trail of Tears is well known from written documents, from the stories passed down by survivors of this forced exodus. And yet, the archaeological traces of this process are pretty paltry, other than some stretches of road here and there that are described as waypoints or avenues through which people passed. There are traces of farmsteads and forts that might have been waypoints. But for the most part, there's not a strong archaeological signature for the Trail of Tears. And yet in 1987, Congress designated this as a National Historic Trail because one can recognize the importance of physical spaces and monuments as ways to allow people to really connect physically and viscerally to past historical processes, and to do so together, just like we saw the students earlier gathered around the excavation site of the concentration camp at Sobibor. Physical spaces promote a collective remembering and hopefully prevent a collective forgetting of historical events that we might collectively be ashamed of, like the Trail of Tears. So what does this look like in the ways we're approaching the Undocumented Migration Project as an archaeological project? Well, we see our attempts to valorize these materials as something that comes out of our fieldwork, classification, and curation. As I mentioned earlier, the fieldwork is largely undertaken through an undergraduate field school, so students are learning the same archaeological techniques they would be at a site or a project focused on prehistoric archaeology. They're learning how to document artifacts and document sites. And this is a sort of bizarre and strange thing, which means that it gets attention from the local public, from newspapers, and can help keep the light on what's going on along the US-Mexico border. And so we also, by using the language of archaeology, referring to migrant objects as artifacts instead of trash, never mind the headline to this article, and referring to the sites as archaeological sites instead of dumps, we hope to emphasize the ways in which these material objects are a part of history and document a historical process and are valuable for understanding the lives of people who experience this project or process, that they're not simply, these objects are not simply trash out there in the desert. We can also think about the ways in which the curation and display of these objects helps create the same sort of value, going back to the state of exception. When we display these things under glass, we're emphasizing that they're valuable and that they're meant to be preserved. And this helps us understand that migrant experiences and the needless death along the US-Mexico border need to be reckoned with, and they need to be remembered in the years to come. I'd like to close with a few points that I've tried to make throughout this talk in adopting an archaeology of the contemporary approach to undocumented migration. And by studying migrant backpacks, we hope with this project to emphasize and to amplify migrant accounts themselves, their accounts of suffering and survival out there in the desert. At the same time, we also hope to explore and demonstrate how these stories sort of scale up into a broader social process in humanitarian crisis, and to humanize these numbers of thousands of apprehensions and thousands of deaths. We also want to be using archaeology as a way to give value to these materials for future remembering and looking back on the early 21st century in the United States. By valuing these materials, we're giving value and asserting the historical value of undocumented migration and migrants themselves, and creating a reservoir of materials that can help us collectively remember this in the decades, centuries, and perhaps millennia to come. I'd like to thank you all for inviting me to participate again in the Boshell lecture series. I, in turn, would like to thank members of the UMP, the groups that work with us in Southern Arizona, such as the Tucson Samaritans, the community of 𝗕𝗏𝗃𝗃, and of course, and above all, the migrants who've shared their stories with the UMP over the years. If you'd like to learn more about this project, I'd encourage you to check out the Undocumented Migration Project website shown here. I've also given you links to the 𝗕𝗏𝗃𝗃 Center and Humane Borders if you'd like to learn more or get involved with the fight for migrant rights. Again, thank you and take care.